Welcome to the channel. Today, we're diving into some truly spine-chilling stories that all take place on highways, those long, lonely stretches of road where isolation can lead to eerie encounters. These unsettling experiences range from strange sightings and unexplained paranormal activity to the sheer terror of being alone in the dark, with something sinister lurking just beyond the headlights. If you've ever felt uneasy while driving late at night, this video will take you into that unsettling world of highway horrors. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching this video from? We'd love to hear where our viewers are tuning in as we explore these terrifying tales together. Trapped by highway predators. In the vast, remote highways of West Texas, Martin Valdez was driving home from a late business trip, the only company being the endless stretch of road ahead. The clock on his dashboard blinked 1:30 a.m., and the distant horizon was swallowed by darkness, with only the occasional flicker of light from a distant town. Martin had taken this route dozens of times, and although it was isolated, he always found solace in the quietness of the open road. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt different, heavier somehow. As his truck rounded a bend, Martin noticed the flickering of hazard lights ahead. Parked on the shoulder of the road was an old sedan, smoke rising from its hood. A woman stood beside the car, waving frantically. Martin hesitated for a moment, his instincts urging caution, but he couldn't ignore the situation. The thought of leaving someone stranded on this desolate highway didn't sit right with him. Pulling over behind the car, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out. The woman seemed relieved as he approached, her hands shaking as she explained that her tire had blown out and she didn't know how to change it. Martin offered a reassuring smile, telling her he could help. As he crouched down to inspect the flat tire, something gnawed at the back of his mind. The situation felt off. The tire was slashed clean through, not punctured like an accident would cause. He glanced over his shoulder at the woman, who was nervously glancing toward the nearby woods. The dark tree-line loomed, silent and foreboding. A creeping sense of dread settled over him. As Martin worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he heard faint rustling from the woods. A fleeting movement caught his eye, figures, barely visible, shifting among the trees. His heart began to pound. Something was very wrong. Martin's pulse quickened as he tried to focus on the task at hand. His hands worked faster now, but his mind was racing. The figures in the woods moved with unsettling precision, slowly advancing from the shadows. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers trembling as he tried to loosen the lug nuts on the wheel. The woman stood a few feet behind him, her nervous glances toward the trees becoming more frequent. Something wasn't right. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the tension in the air thickening with every second. She shifted her stance uneasily, and Martin's suspicion grew. "I think you should get back in the car," Martin suggested, his voice strained. The woman didn't move, her face twisting in an expression he couldn't read. Her silence only confirmed his fear, this wasn't an accident. Then he heard it, footsteps, faint but unmistakable, crunching on the gravel behind him. His instincts screamed at him to run. Slowly, Martin stood up, turning toward the source of the sound. Emerging from the woods were three men, their faces obscured by the low light, but their intentions clear from the way they held themselves. One carried a length of rope slung over his shoulder, another held a rusted knife gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Martin's breath caught in his throat. It was a setup. He took a step back, his eyes darting between the woman and the advancing men. The woman's once anxious demeanor had melted away, replaced with a cold, detached calm. She was part of it, a lure for unsuspecting travelers. As Martin's mind raced, the reality of the situation hit him with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just a robbery. The men, the woman, the eerie stillness of the night, it was all wrong. The figures' slow, deliberate movements, the strange chanting Martin could barely make out, carried a sinister purpose. His heart pounded as the men closed in, and Martin realized there was only one option: escape. Martin's body moved before his mind fully registered the danger. He bolted toward his truck, his heart hammering in his chest as the men sprang into action. Their heavy footsteps pounded against the gravel, closing the distance faster than he expected. Martin's breath was ragged as he fumbled for his keys, cursing under his breath when they slipped from his fingers. The cold, creeping dread clawed at his mind, but he forced himself to stay focused. The truck door slammed behind him as he jumped inside, locking it just as one of the men reached the handle. The twisted face of the attacker pressed against the window, his breath fogging up the glass as his fingers clawed at the door, desperate to get inside. For a moment, Martin could see the madness in his eyes, the hunger for something more than robbery. It was the look of a predator who had found its prey. Without wasting another second, Martin turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but just as he shifted into gear, he saw something that chilled his blood. In the rearview mirror, beyond the figures still chasing after him, an orange glow flickered in the distance. It was a fire, a bonfire, no doubt prepared for something far worse than theft. His mind raced with the horror of what he had almost walked into. He knew, deep down, that they weren't planning to let him go easily. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the gravel as Martin sped down the highway. The figures shrank in the distance, but he could still hear the echo of their haunting chant. "You shouldn't be here." The words stuck in his mind like a curse, reverberating through the growing darkness around him. But it wasn't over. Just as he reached a bend in the road, a blinding light appeared ahead, headlights. A second car, cutting him off. Martin's heart sank as he realized the woman and her accomplices weren't working alone. Another vehicle had been waiting, ready to trap him. Swerving to avoid the oncoming car, Martin veered off the road and into the desert scrub, his truck jolting violently as it tore through the rough terrain. He could hear the engine straining, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins gave him only one mission: escape, no matter the cost. The truck skidded through the desert, the sound of gravel and dry brush grinding beneath the tires as Martin fought to keep control. The pursuing car's headlights pierced the darkness, growing closer by the second. His pulse thundered in his ears, the panic rising as he glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the figures still chasing him, their faces lit by the eerie glow of the distant fire. He could still hear their haunting chant, almost like a twisted song echoing in his mind. "You shouldn't be here." The fire wasn't just for warmth, Martin knew it now. It was a ritual. He was supposed to be the sacrifice, another soul to disappear on this forgotten stretch of highway. His mind reeled at the realization, but he had no time to dwell on it. He had to focus on getting away. Suddenly, his truck lurched to the side as one of the men's cars rammed into him, sending him spinning off the road and into a ditch. The impact jolted through his body, and for a moment, the world blurred. When his vision cleared, the truck was stalled, and the eerie silence of the desert surrounded him. The chanting grew louder as the figures approached. Martin knew this was it, the end. But as they closed in, something inside him snapped. Desperation flooded his veins, fueling his instincts. He grabbed a flare gun from the glove compartment, the only thing he could find. Without thinking, he stumbled out of the truck, aimed at the cabin, their hideout in the distance, and fired. The flare shot into the sky, illuminating the night, before plunging down onto the roof of the old building. In an instant, flames erupted, engulfing the cabin in a fiery blaze. The figures stopped, their chanting silenced as the fire consumed the place they had used to trap their victims. The flames spread quickly, and in their confusion, Martin seized his chance. He sprinted toward the open highway, running for his life. The fire grew brighter behind him, and the distant chanting turned into screams. Martin didn't stop until he saw headlights in the distance, this time from a real passing car. As the vehicle slowed down, he knew he had finally escaped, leaving the ritual, the fire, and the nightmare behind. 3 a.m., a terrifying encounter. Ethan Miller drove down the narrow, desolate road, the hum of his old truck's engine the only sound breaking the silence. It was late, way past midnight, and the empty road stretched out in front of him like a dark ribbon, disappearing into the trees. The world outside seemed frozen, the air thick with an eerie stillness. His mind wandered, tired from another long shift at the factory, and his eyes kept flicking to the clock. 2:58 a.m. 2 minutes until the dreaded hour. The hour his coworkers joked about, calling it the witching hour, the time when strange things happen in the darkness. He shrugged off the thought, but a cold chill crept up his spine. It was probably just exhaustion playing tricks on him. He hadn't had much sleep lately, and everything felt off. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, but everything beyond was swallowed in black. As the clock flipped to 3 a.m., Ethan's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The engine's rhythm echoed in his head like a heartbeat, steady but loud in the silence. Then, out of nowhere, something appeared on the road. His foot instinctively slammed on the brake, tires screeching against the gravel as the truck jerked to a stop. Standing in the middle of the road was something. At first, it seemed like an animal, but as the lights fully revealed it, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was tall, unnaturally tall, covered in thick, matted fur that shimmered under the dim glow of the headlights. Its eyes, they weren't the eyes of any creature Ethan knew. They glowed, like embers, burning bright yellow and staring straight at him, unblinking. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. He couldn't look away, even though every instinct screamed at him to run. The creature stood perfectly still, its fur moving slightly in the wind, but it didn't make a sound. For a second, it felt like the world had stopped. The silence was crushing. Then, as if on cue, the creature's lips curled back, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. A low growl rumbled from its chest, vibrating through the air like distant thunder. Ethan's pulse raced, and his grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the creature took a step forward, its massive frame looming over the truck. Ethan could feel its presence pressing down on him, a suffocating weight of dread. He couldn't move. The creature's eyes seemed to pierce straight through him, as if it could see his deepest fears. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the creature turned and vanished into the trees, its body blending with the darkness as if it had never been there. But the memory of those glowing eyes stayed with him, burned into his mind. Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. His heart was still pounding, echoing in his ears as he stared at the spot where the creature had been. The road was empty now, but the air felt different, heavier, like it was alive with something unseen. The night, once quiet, seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. He hesitated for a moment, his breath shaky, trying to convince himself it was all in his head. Maybe it was a hallucination, the result of exhaustion. But deep down, he knew better. What he saw was real. He slowly pressed the gas pedal, the truck creeping forward, the headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. Every shadow now seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves made him jump. His eyes flicked to the tree-line, scanning the woods for any sign of the creature. Nothing. The road ahead looked endless, stretching out like a narrow path through the unknown. As the truck rolled forward, a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even though the creature had disappeared. The trees seemed to close in on him, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, casting long, crooked shadows across the road. Every nerve in his body was on edge, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. But what could he do? Stopping wasn't an option, and turning back didn't feel right either. All he could do was keep driving, hoping that whatever had just happened wouldn't repeat itself. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered. Ethan's eyes widened, and panic surged through him as the truck jerked forward, then stalled completely. The headlights flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. He sat there, frozen, gripping the wheel, his knuckles white. The silence was suffocating, the only sound is shallow breathing. He reached for the ignition, turning the key frantically, but the engine only sputtered in response, refusing to start. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. His mind raced, trying to think of what to do next. The creature, it was still out there, somewhere in the dark. And now, he was stuck. Vulnerable. He glanced out the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he strained to see anything in the inky blackness beyond. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound almost deafening in the stillness. Suddenly, a low growl cut through the silence. Ethan froze, his eyes darting to the side. The growl was closer this time, much closer. His pulse quickened, and his stomach dropped as he realized the creature hadn't left after all. It had been waiting. Slowly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the night, heavy and deliberate, moving toward him from the darkness. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the footsteps grew louder. He strained to see through the window, but the darkness was absolute, as if the night itself was swallowing everything around him. His hands were shaking, fingers slipping off the steering wheel as his heart thudded loudly in his chest. It felt like the creature was closing in, inch by inch, its presence growing heavier with every step. Then, in the far distance, just beyond the edge of the trees, something flickered, a pair of glowing yellow eyes. Ethan's blood ran cold. The creature was back, watching him from the shadows. Its eyes gleamed like molten gold, cutting through the darkness, and Ethan couldn't look away. He was trapped in its gaze, the terror gripping him like a vice. The creature didn't move, just stood there, staring, as if it was studying him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A soft rustling came from the underbrush, and Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't stay in the truck. He had to get out, had to find a way to escape before the creature got any closer. But where could he go? The woods were dense, the road endless, and he was completely alone. His stomach twisted in fear, but there was no time to think, only act. His fingers fumbled for the door handle, his breath quick and shallow as he pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Stepping out of the truck, the cool night air hit him like a wave, sending shivers down his spine. He glanced around, searching for any sign of movement. The eyes had disappeared again, swallowed by the darkness, but he knew the creature was still out there. He could feel it, like a presence lurking just beyond his vision, waiting to pounce. His heart pounded in his ears as he crept toward the edge of the road, his footsteps barely audible against the gravel. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a low growl, deeper this time, more menacing. Ethan whipped his head around, his pulse racing. The sound was closer, too close. His body tensed, every instinct screaming for him to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He stood frozen, eyes wide, as the growl grew louder, the creature's heavy footsteps echoing through the night. It was coming for him. In a desperate move, Ethan turned and bolted into the trees, branches whipping against his face as he ran. The woods seemed endless, the shadows closing in from all sides, but he didn't stop. Behind him, the footsteps quickened, the growl turning into a snarl that sent chills down his spine. The creature was right behind him, its breath hot on the back of his neck. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel its presence, looming closer with every step. Ethan's lungs burned as he ran, branches scraping against his skin, tearing at his clothes. The forest seemed alive, closing in on him with every step. The air was thick, suffocating, and the darkness was all-encompassing, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every instinct told him to keep moving, but the sound of the creature behind him, the heavy, rapid footsteps and the low, guttural snarls, was getting louder. It was gaining on him. His foot caught on a root, and Ethan stumbled, barely managing to catch himself before hitting the ground. He shot a glance over his shoulder, and there it was. The creature's eyes blazed like twin fires in the darkness, its hulking form moving with a terrifying speed. It was close now, too close. He could hear its breath, ragged and fierce, as it tore through the underbrush, relentless in its pursuit. Panic surged through Ethan's veins. He had to keep going. But the forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of shadows and looming trees, and no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was toying with him, letting him get just far enough before closing in again. His heart pounded in his chest, his legs aching with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, and Ethan tumbled forward, crashing down a steep embankment. Dirt and rocks scraped against his skin as he rolled, his body slamming into the earth with a force that knocked the wind out of him. He came to a stop at the bottom, gasping for breath, his head spinning. The world around him blurred, the shadows dancing in his vision. But the sound of the creature, the low, menacing growl, cut through the haze, pulling him back into reality. Ethan struggled to his feet, his body aching, but there was no time to rest. He glanced up the embankment, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the creature standing at the top, its glowing eyes fixed on him. It stood there for a moment, watching him with a dark intensity that sent chills down his spine. Then, without warning, it leaped down, landing with a heavy thud just a few feet away. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He was out of time. Desperation took over, and he turned, sprinting deeper into the woods. But the creature was faster. It moved with a terrifying speed, its footsteps pounding the earth like thunder. Ethan's pulse raced as he heard it closing in, the sound of snapping branches and the rustling of leaves filling the air. He pushed himself harder, but the creature's presence was overwhelming, its breath hot on his neck, its growls growing louder. Just as he thought it would catch him, the trees parted ahead, revealing a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through Ethan's chest. He wasn't far from the road. If he could just make it to the light, maybe, just maybe, he could escape. Strange lights and a faceless figure. It was a cold, rainy night on the endless stretch of the Stewart Highway in Australia. Officer Jake Callahan had been patrolling these roads for years, but nothing ever prepared him for the strange occurrences that would haunt his nights. The rain pelted against his windshield, the rhythmic thrum of the wipers providing a steady, almost hypnotic beat. His headlights cut through the downpour, illuminating the empty road ahead. Or so he thought. Out of nowhere, a faint pair of taillights appeared in the distance, barely visible through the sheets of rain. It was unusual to see any vehicle at this hour, especially in such weather. Jake squinted, trying to make out the shape of the car, but it was too far away. He pressed down on the gas, speeding up slightly to close the distance. The taillights flickered, dimming and brightening, almost as if they were malfunctioning. A chill ran down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. As he got closer, the car came into view. It was an old sedan, the kind that hadn't been seen on the roads for decades. Its battered exterior was covered in rust, and its windows were fogged up, obscuring the interior. Jake's brow furrowed. There were no plates on the car, nothing to identify it. He radioed in, but the static was unusually strong tonight, making it impossible to get a clear signal. Something about the car felt off. He couldn't shake the unease creeping into his gut. He flipped on his siren, signaling for the car to pull over. But instead of slowing down, the taillights blinked once more before disappearing completely. Jake blinked in disbelief. One moment the car was there, the next it was gone. He slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the wet asphalt as his cruiser skidded to a halt. The rain poured harder, hammering against the roof of the car. Jake jumped out, his flashlight in hand, scanning the area where the car had been. Nothing. There were no skid marks, no signs of a vehicle ever being there. The road was slick but untouched. His heart raced as he stood in the pouring rain, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing. It was as if the car had vanished into thin air. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it had been a trick of the rain, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, he knew what he saw was real. The air felt heavier, the rain colder. Jake glanced around once more before retreating to the safety of his patrol car. He sat behind the wheel, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, still staring at the spot where the car had disappeared. Something wasn't right. Something was out there. The following night, the rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield of Officer Callahan's cruiser. Jake couldn't stop thinking about the old car that had vanished. It gnawed at him, an unsolved mystery that refused to leave his mind. He had told no one, fearing they'd think he was losing it. But he knew what he saw. It had been real. As his shift dragged on, the rain showed no sign of letting up. His headlights reflected off the slick asphalt, and the wipers struggled to keep the view clear. The highway was nearly deserted, as it usually was during these downpours. Still, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting. His eyes scanned the road ahead, tense and alert. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, walking along the shoulder of the highway. Jake furrowed his brow. A pedestrian out here, in this weather? He slowed his car, pulling up beside the person. Rain blurred the figure's outline, but something felt off. They were walking stiffly, head down, as if completely unaware of the pouring rain. Jake rolled down his window and called out, "Hey, you all right?" The figure didn't respond. It kept moving, slow and deliberate, as if in a trance. Jake's unease deepened. He parked the car on the shoulder and stepped out, rain immediately drenching his uniform. "Hey!" he shouted again, moving closer. The person stopped. Jake's flashlight beam illuminated the figure fully now, an ordinary man in a soaked raincoat, but something was horribly wrong. The man turned slowly toward Jake, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The figure had no face. Where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, glistening under the rain. Jake's breath caught in his throat. His body froze, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. The faceless figure stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for Jake to do something. A surge of panic gripped him. He stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. "What the hell?" he whispered, the words barely audible over the rain. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure cocked its head slightly, as if considering him, then turned and began walking again, disappearing into the downpour as if it had never existed. Jake staggered back to his patrol car, his hands shaking as he fumbled to open the door. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it instinctively. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he gripped the steering wheel, eyes wide with fear. He looked out the window, expecting to see the figure again, but the road was empty. It was gone. But deep down, he knew that whatever he had just encountered wasn't finished with him yet. The third night felt different. The rain was as heavy as ever, turning the world into a misty blur of water and shadows, but the atmosphere had shifted. Jake's nerves were on edge. After the faceless figure, he didn't trust the highway anymore. Every mile of the road seemed to pulse with an unseen force, as if something was watching him from the darkness beyond the rain. He had driven this stretch 1,000 times, but now it felt foreign, hostile. His headlights pierced through the storm, barely illuminating the wet asphalt ahead. As he patrolled, his thoughts kept circling back to the events of the past 2 nights. First, the disappearing car. Then, the faceless figure. These were things that defied explanation, things that didn't belong in the real world. Yet, he had seen them with his own eyes. Each encounter had left him more shaken, more convinced that something was deeply wrong. As he rounded a bend in the highway, Jake's heart skipped a beat. Up ahead, a crash scene emerged through the downpour. A car had veered off the road, its front end smashed against a tree, steam hissing from the engine. The rain distorted the scene, making it hard to see clearly, but there were no flashing lights, no other officers, no sign that the crash had been reported. Jake pulled over and stepped out, his boots sinking into the mud as the rain soaked him. He reached for his flashlight and approached the wreck cautiously. Something about the scene felt off. There were no skid marks, no signs of a struggle, and the car door was wide open, but no one was inside. He scanned the area, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the rain. Nothing. As he got closer, a strange glow caught his eye. Hovering just above the wreckage were lights, small, eerie orbs of blue and white, flickering in and out of existence. They floated like fireflies, but their light was unnatural, casting geometric shapes in the air that pulsed with an odd rhythm. Jake's breath hitched. The lights seemed alive, but not in a way he could understand. He took a step back, his heart racing. The lights twisted and swirled in intricate patterns, moving with a precision that was too deliberate to be random. For a moment, Jake felt a pull, as if the lights were calling to him, drawing him closer. His mind was screaming at him to turn away, to run, but his body was rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the unnatural beauty of the scene. Suddenly, the lights blinked out. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, leaving nothing but the wrecked car and the pouring rain. Jake stumbled backward, his pulse racing. Whatever had just happened was beyond his comprehension, But one thing was clear, something, or someone, was toying with him. And it wasn't over yet. Jake sat in his patrol car, drenched and shaking, his mind racing. The strange lights had disappeared, leaving only the wrecked car behind. He stared at the highway stretching ahead of him, bathed in the dim glow of his headlights. The rain was relentless, pounding the roof like a drumbeat. He could feel it now, more than ever, an overwhelming sense that something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had faced strange things on the road, but this was something beyond anything he could explain. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The highway had never felt so long, so empty. Every instinct told him to leave, to drive as far from this place as possible. But something inside him, a deep, nagging curiosity, kept him rooted to the spot. He needed answers. What was happening out here? And why him? As he sat there, lost in thought, his radio crackled to life. Static buzzed in his ear, followed by a faint voice. "Officer Callahan, do you copy?" Jake grabbed the radio, relief flooding through him at the familiar sound of dispatch. "This is Callahan," he responded, his voice steady, though his heart was still racing. "We've been trying to reach you for hours, Jake." "Where are you?" Jake glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Hours? It had felt like minutes since he arrived at the crash site. He looked around again, confusion settling in. "I'm at a crash site, but there's no one here. No bodies, no backup. Just lights." His voice trailed off as he tried to explain what he had seen, but the words felt hollow, like he couldn't truly capture the strangeness of it all. "Jake, there's no report of any crash in your area," the voice on the radio continued, a note of concern creeping in. "You need to leave that place. Now." But before he could respond, the static returned, louder this time, drowning out the voice completely. The radio went dead. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye in the rearview mirror. Jake's blood turned to ice as he saw the same old, rusted car from the first night, its taillights glowing faintly through the rain. It was parked right behind him, motionless, as if it had appeared from thin air. His heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at the wrecked car in front of him, then back to the mirror. The old car was gone again. Panic surged through him. He slammed the car into gear and hit the gas, tires spinning on the slick road as he sped down the highway. The rain pelted against the windshield, blurring his vision, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away. Away from the wreckage, away from the faceless figure, away from whatever had been stalking him these past nights. But as he drove, the lights appeared again, this time ahead of him. Geometric shapes hovered in the air, glowing ominously, blocking his path. Jake's breath hitched. There was no escape. Secrets exposed by a sinister hitchhiker. It was supposed to be a simple carpool. Just 4 coworkers heading home after a long day at the office. The night was calm, with only the faint hum of the tires on the pavement and the occasional murmur of small talk filling the car. Olivia, the driver, kept her eyes on the road, while Dan, seated beside her, scrolled through his phone. In the back seat sat Alex and Mara, quietly chatting about work, each lost in their own thoughts. The mood was ordinary, nothing out of the ordinary, until they saw him. A man, standing alone on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched in the classic hitchhiker pose. Olivia hesitated, her foot hovering over the brake. It was strange to see someone out this late, especially on such a desolate stretch of highway. The others exchanged glances, unsure. Dan shrugged. "Might as well pick him up. It's late, and the next town isn't for miles." Against her better judgment, Olivia pulled over. The man approached slowly, his face obscured by the shadows of the dim streetlights. He wore a tattered jacket, his hair disheveled and damp from the misty air. As he slid into the back seat next to Alex, a strange chill filled the car, but no one said anything. "Thanks for the ride," he said in a low, gravelly voice. His eyes, though dark and unreadable, seemed to flicker with something unsettling. Olivia nodded silently and pulled back onto the road. For a while, the ride was quiet again, but the atmosphere had changed. The stranger sat silently, his gaze moving from one passenger to the next, as if sizing them up. Alex shifted uncomfortably, while Mara avoided eye contact, staring out the window. Dan, however, seemed unfazed, scrolling through his phone. After a few minutes, the stranger spoke. "Funny, isn't it? How everyone has secrets. Even in a car like this, full of people pretending to be normal." Olivia's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. The hitchhiker chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver through the group. "Oh, just an observation," he said, leaning back in his seat. "You'd be surprised what people are hiding." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. Olivia could feel the weight of his words sinking in. Everyone had secrets, sure, but something about the way he said it made it feel personal. Too personal. Without warning, the hitchhiker turned his gaze to Alex, a sly smile creeping across his face. "Like you, Alex," he said casually, as if talking about the weather. "You ever tell anyone about that night? The one where you were driving home, a little too drunk, and hit something? Or someone?" Alex froze, his heart pounding in his chest. His face went pale as if the very air had been sucked out of his lungs. "What? How do you?" The car fell into a stunned silence. Alex's face drained of color as the hitchhiker's words hung heavy in the air. He swallowed hard, his mind racing back to that terrible night, the one he had buried deep in his memory, never daring to speak of it again. No one knew about the accident. Not his friends, not his family. How could this stranger know? I don't know what you're talking about," Alex stammered, his voice shaky, but the hitchhiker's smile only widened, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Of course you don't," the man said softly, his tone mocking. "After all, it's easier to pretend it didn't happen. To forget." The tension in the car was palpable, every passenger now on edge. Mara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes flicking nervously between Alex and the hitchhiker. Olivia gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Dan, for the first time, looked up from his phone, his face twisted in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence, but no one answered. The hitchhiker turned his gaze to Mara next. "And you, Mara," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "do you ever think about the lies you've told? How many people have you manipulated with that sweet smile of yours? It must be exhausting, pretending to care all the time." Mara's stomach churned as her chest tightened with guilt. She had always been good at hiding her real feelings, using charm to climb the social and professional ladder. But how could this stranger know about the web of lies she had spun to get ahead? "Stop it," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the hitchhiker continued, relentless. "You see, I know things," he said, his tone shifting from casual to menacing. "I know things about all of you. The things you hide, the things that keep you up at night. It's funny how guilt works. You think you've buried it, but it never really goes away, does it? It festers. It grows." Dan, trying to shake off the growing fear, scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You're just some freak playing mind games." But even as he said it, a bead of sweat trickled down his forehead. The hitchhiker's eyes flicked toward him, his smile fading into something darker, more sinister. "Oh, Dan," he said softly, "do you really think you're any better? How long have you been lying to your wife? Or does she still think those business trips are real?" Dan's face went slack with shock. The truth hit him like a freight train, his secrets laid bare in front of everyone. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands began to tremble. How could this stranger know? The car felt smaller now, suffocating under the weight of their exposed guilt. Olivia's voice cracked as she finally spoke. "Who are you?" The hitchhiker turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. "You'll find out soon enough." The car sped down the dark, winding road, the tension inside it growing thicker with every passing second. Olivia's eyes flicked nervously between the rearview mirror and the road ahead, her heart racing. The rain had begun to fall, lightly at first, but now it tapped steadily against the windshield. The slick highway stretched endlessly before them, illuminated only by the faint glow of the headlights. The world outside felt empty, desolate, like they were driving through a void. But inside the car, it was anything but empty. The hitchhiker leaned back in his seat, his expression calm, almost amused, as if he reveled in the chaos he was creating. His presence was suffocating, filling the small space with a sense of impending doom. No one spoke. The silence was unbearable, yet no one dared break it. They were all trapped with their own thoughts, their own guilt gnawing at them like an open wound. The rain intensified, and Olivia tightened her grip on the wheel, her knuckles white. She had been driving for miles now, but the road seemed endless. The trees lining the highway were nothing but dark shapes, blurred by the rain. She wanted to pull over, to stop and get away from the hitchhiker's piercing gaze, but she couldn't. Something about this road, this night, felt inescapable, as if they were being drawn towards something dark and inevitable. Suddenly, the hitchhiker's voice cut through the silence, smooth and eerie. "Where are you running from, Olivia?" he asked, his eyes locked on her through the rearview mirror. She flinched but didn't answer. "You think you can keep driving, keep running, but you'll never escape it. The truth always catches up." Olivia's heart raced. She kept her eyes on the road, the rain blurring her vision, but the hitchhiker's words echoed in her mind. She had her own secrets, ones she had buried deep, but now, under his gaze, they seemed to rise to the surface, clawing their way out. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Just shut up," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The car hit a sharp curve, and Olivia jerked the wheel to correct the course, her breath hitching. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making it hard to see. But as they rounded the bend, something caught her eye, a figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the storm. She blinked, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment, it looked like another hitchhiker, just standing there in the rain, but as they passed, the figure disappeared. She gasped, her grip tightening on the wheel. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The others in the car were silent, too terrified to respond. The hitchhiker, however, simply smiled. "Oh, I saw it," he said, his voice low and mocking. "But you're not seeing everything yet." The road stretched on, but something told Olivia that they were no longer on the same highway. The world around them had shifted. And whatever lay ahead wasn't something they could outrun. The rain came down in torrents, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the storm. Olivia's eyes darted nervously between the road and the hitchhiker in the rearview mirror. The others sat in tense silence, their faces pale, shadows of fear etched across them. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, but something was wrong. It didn't feel like the same road they had been driving on. The trees seemed twisted, the lines on the road blurred and distorted. They were trapped, not just in the car, but in something far more sinister. The hitchhiker leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the car like a weight pressing down on their chests. "There's no point in running," he said calmly, his voice smooth, almost comforting, but laced with something dark. "You can't escape the truth." Mara, who had been quiet for too long, finally snapped. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "How do you know all of this?" Her words hung in the air, desperate and accusing. The hitchhiker smiled, the kind of smile that chilled to the bone. "I know because I've been watching," he said softly. "I've been with you for longer than you realize. I've seen everything." Dan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Olivia. "We need to get him out of the car," he muttered, his voice low but urgent. Olivia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They couldn't keep driving like this. The road had become a nightmare, twisting and turning into something unrecognizable. They were no longer in control. Olivia pulled the car over, the tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The storm raged around them, the wind howling through the trees. She turned to face the hitchhiker, her voice trembling. "You need to get out," she said, trying to sound firm but failing to hide the fear in her voice. "This ride is over." For the first time, the hitchhiker's smile faded. His eyes darkened, and the air in the car seemed to grow colder. "You think you can just get rid of me?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "You invited me in. Now you have to face what you've been hiding." The tension in the car reached a breaking point. Dan reached for the door, but the hitchhiker's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. In that moment, the car was flooded with a blinding flash of light. Olivia shielded her eyes, her heart racing, and when the light faded, the hitchhiker was gone. The car was silent, save for the pounding of the rain. They all sat there, stunned, unsure of what had just happened. The storm outside seemed to quiet, and the road ahead was clear once more. But something had changed. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight gone. Slowly, Olivia put the car back into gear, and they drove forward, the night slowly returning to normal. But none of them spoke. None of them dared to ask what the hitchhiker had been, or how he had known their deepest, darkest secrets. All they knew was that something had shifted inside them. Something they couldn't ignore. Truck driver versus mythical beast. Jake Harrison had been driving the same desolate roads of the Australian outback for years. His route took him through some of the most isolated parts of the country, where the only company was the vast expanse of red earth, scrubby trees, and endless sky. Tonight, like many nights before, he was alone, with nothing but the rumble of his truck and the occasional crackle of static on the radio. The air was thick with the dry heat of the desert, even though the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. It was past midnight, and Jake's eyelids were heavy, threatening to close. He blinked hard, forcing himself to stay alert. The road stretched out ahead of him, a long, straight line disappearing into the darkness. There wasn't another car in sight, no sign of life for miles. Just him, the road, and the eerie silence of the outback. Then, as he rounded a bend, something caught his eye, a small, shimmering light in the distance. Jake frowned, his grip on the wheel tightening. It was unusual to see any kind of light out here, especially this late. He slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield. As he drew closer, the light took shape. It was a small billabong, one of the many natural waterholes scattered throughout the outback, its surface reflecting the pale glow of the moon. Jake pulled the truck to a stop, curiosity getting the better of him. He had passed this spot many times before, but had never noticed the water. Maybe it was the fatigue messing with his head, or maybe it was something else, but there was an unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. He opened the door and stepped out, the dry heat hitting him like a wall. The air was still, unnaturally quiet. As Jake approached the edge of the billabong, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The water was completely still, almost too still, like glass. There was no breeze, no sound of insects, nothing. He peered into the darkness, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. Then, out of nowhere, the water rippled. Jake froze. The ripple wasn't from the wind. It was too deliberate, too sudden. His heart began to race as he scanned the water, but there was nothing. No fish, no movement, just the ripple slowly fading back into stillness. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but before he could turn, something broke the surface. A pair of glowing yellow eyes stared up at him from the water, unblinking. The creature slowly emerged, its body covered in dark, matted fur, its mouth full of sharp teeth that gleamed in the moonlight. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had heard the stories, old legends of the bunyip, a creature that lived in the billabongs, but he had never believed them. Until now. Jake stood frozen at the edge of the billabong, his eyes locked on the creature emerging from the water. The bunyip was larger than he had imagined, its body thick and hulking, covered in slick fur that clung to its muscular frame. The creature's yellow eyes never left his, glowing with an unnatural intensity. Its long, sharp teeth glistened under the moonlight, and as it moved closer, the water around it rippled in unnatural patterns. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse quickening with every breath. He had heard the old stories of the bunyip, tales passed down by the indigenous people of the outback. A mythical water creature that stalked billabongs and rivers, waiting for unsuspecting prey to come too close. But they were just that, stories. At least, that's what Jake had always told himself. Yet here it was, the creature of legend, slowly dragging itself toward him, its yellow eyes gleaming with hunger. The outback, usually so quiet and still, now felt alive with the presence of this ancient terror. The air seemed to thrum with an invisible energy, and Jake's mind raced with the sudden realization that he had ventured too far from his truck. His feet felt glued to the ground, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He stood there, paralyzed with fear, watching the creature inch closer, its massive form rising higher out of the water. The bunyip let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated through the air and sent shivers down Jake's spine. The creature's fur dripped with the dark water of the billabong, and its claws, long and jagged, scraped against the muddy shore as it pulled itself closer to land. Jake swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He needed to move, now. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Jake turned and bolted back toward his truck, his boots slipping on the damp earth. His heart raced as he heard the creature behind him, its heavy body moving through the water with a speed that defied its size. He didn't dare look back. The only thing that mattered was reaching the truck. The landscape around him blurred as he sprinted, the desert shrubs and dry earth fading into a mix of shadows and fear. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his legs burned with the effort, but the sound of the creature's growl echoed in his ears, pushing him to run faster. The truck was just ahead, its headlights still on, a beacon of safety in the darkness. Jake lunged forward, his fingers reaching for the door handle, but as he grabbed it, something cold and wet brushed against his leg. He glanced down, his stomach lurching with terror. The creature had caught up to him, its claws reaching out, inches away from grabbing him. Jake's heart stopped as he felt the wet, clawed hand of the creature brush against his leg. Panic surged through his veins, and in a desperate move, he yanked the truck door open and threw himself inside. He slammed the door shut just as the creature's claws scraped against the metal, leaving deep gashes in the door frame. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The truck's interior was filled with the sharp stench of sweat and fear, but there was no time to think, only act. Outside, the bunyip let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the cab of the truck. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he glanced through the windshield. The creature stood at the edge of the billabong, its hulking frame silhouetted against the moonlit water. Its yellow eyes burned with anger, and its jagged teeth gleamed in the darkness. It took a step toward the truck, its long claws scraping against the earth, determined to reach him. Jake's fingers finally found the ignition, and the truck roared to life with a violent shudder. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning on the wet ground before finally gaining traction. The truck lurched forward, throwing Jake back in his seat as it tore down the dirt road. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of the engine drowning out everything else. But even as he sped away, he could hear the creature's growls in the distance, a reminder that it wasn't far behind. The narrow outback road stretched endlessly ahead of him, the landscape bathed in eerie moonlight. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. He half expected to see the bunyip chasing him, but the road remained empty. Still, the fear gnawed at him, he wasn't safe yet. The truck bounced and rattled as it sped over the rough terrain, the tires kicking up clouds of dust. Jake's mind raced, replaying the encounter in vivid detail. How close he had come to becoming another victim of the bunyip. He had heard stories of people disappearing near billabongs, their bodies never found, but he never imagined he would face the creature himself. The reality of it all felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. As he drove deeper into the outback, the oppressive weight of the encounter slowly began to lift. The growls faded into the distance, and the road ahead became clearer, more familiar. But Jake knew he would never forget what he had seen, the glowing eyes, the sharp teeth, the unnatural way the creature had emerged from the water. Hours later, when the first rays of dawn began to pierce the horizon, Jake finally allowed himself to relax, his body slumping against the seat in exhaustion. He had escaped. But the outback was vast, and the bunyip was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. So, those were the 5 terrifying stories you just experienced. From the chilling encounter with a hairy creature on an empty road at 3 a.m., to the mysterious, disappearing ghost car and faceless figure during a rainy night. We also saw dark secrets being exposed by a hitchhiker who knew far too much, the terrifying close call of a truck driver escaping a mythical creature in the Australian outback, and the haunting discovery of something lurking deep within the mountains. Each of these stories taps into different fears, from the supernatural to the fear of the unknown and psychological suspense. Now, we want to know, which story scared you the most? Was it the creature in the middle of the night, the eerie hitchhiker, or maybe the mythical bunyip rising from the water? If you enjoyed the video and felt a chill down your spine, don't forget to give it a like and share in the comments which part creeped you out the most. And if you love stories like these, there are many more waiting for you on the Deep channel. The terror and mystery never end here. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new uploads, and take a look at our other spine-chilling videos available right now. Until next time, and hopefully, your dreams won't be as terrifying as these stories. See you soon.